Hey guys, Mr. Bostic here. It seemed like a good idea before our test on Friday to go ahead and do a little more review for Chapter 8. We've already talked about the manor pretty extensively, and this presentation will touch on that, but we're going to focus a little bit more on the town, on the second half of the chapter, along with the growing importance of trade. And so let's go ahead and get started. Here we have, a depiction of the manor, with the house and the fields, etc. It's important to keep in mind that almost all lands in medieval Europe were parts of fiefs controlled from a manor house. The source of a lord's wealth, the source of his titles, the stronghold in times of war, the center of life for almost everybody in times of peace, and mostly self-sufficient. But as the sidelines say, they had to rely on towns, especially in later trade fairs, to sell what they produced in excess and to provide things that they couldn't produce. So, though this is the backbone really of the social structure and where almost everyone lives and operates in some kind of connection, it's not the whole picture, right? On the fiefs of the lords, you also have villages. In fact, a lot of them, right? There's a lot fewer manors than there are villages. But the villages are really the place for residence for peasants, right? And serfs. You have, you know, along a path out among the fields, you'll have a gathering of houses. So you'll have small communities, clusters of homes, but they're not really places of special trade or special legal status. They're simply pockets of residence to maintain those local areas of the fields. By contrast, I mean, towns, of course, are bigger than villages. I mean, as the name would generally suggest, but we're kind of used to these days the idea of, is it a town? Is it a city? Is it a village? Is it a hamlet? I mean, we're a lot looser with the meanings of these terms. A town is a more specific thing originally. A town is really a small city, or a city is a large town. And keeping in mind, they could be smaller or larger. They could be ancient cities that pre-exist feudalism, or more recent, younger cities. But the key thing here is they're defined by a charter, and the charter would be issued sometimes from a nobleman, oftentimes from a king, and it gave the residents of that town a special status under the law, and frankly, a status that's essentially outside the normal feudal structure under a lord within the kind of typical hierarchy of population. And towns themselves became, and in some cases already had been, specialized centers of trade. I mean, industries, to the degree they existed in the medieval world, were centered out of towns. Typically, towns would specialize in one or a few different industries or crafts, manufacturers in particular. And they are the centers of commerce. Most towns, of course, are built in places where natural pathways, whether they're roads or rivers, would intersect and create a good place for trade to happen. And so, the nature of towns and larger towns or cities had always really been such a thing, especially in the ancient world. But what that means is that these people aren't farmers, and they're also not warriors, right? So that they produce a lot of the specialized goods of any kind of unusually particular or kind of craftsman kind of specialized craft sort of nature. They're not being able to dedicate their time to raising food or animals or training as soldiers, and so generally speaking, they're having to pay for their food and pay for their defense. The things like even things like a police force are very much long after the medieval period. In fact, only recent inventions, for that matter, after the founding of America. So you have a different kind of character here, and some really specialized abilities outside the norm, but a lack of some of what everyone else was able to take for granted in a feudal structure. One key thing about the cities is the formation of guilds, and keep in mind at first it's really an association of merchants. They always had a very strong voice in the cities, and in both in controlling the life specifically of their own members, but beyond that, they have, as a collective group of members, they have a strong voice in influencing the way that the city is guided. Eventually, they became trades guilds, and so the guild would focus on a particular industry, and there were many different guilds. However, the guild was a way of having rather than individuals having voices, collective groups had voices of representation in medieval society. And in a city in particular, the guilds were the voices that mattered, right? So there are training schools, taking people from admitting them as apprentices, training them up to be a journeyman, um, employing journeymen, and to the point where they might be able to enter the guild as a master, right? Interestingly enough, that really kind of parallels the training of a knight from being a page to being a squire to becoming a full-scale knight. You have a kind of a parallel there. They're a protection system, or as the book calls it, an insurance system for widows and for families of guilds, as well as guildsmen members in particular. They were the main safeguard against poor quality and bad workmanship, as well as against unfair prices, whether that means a price that's too low for the skill of the craftsman who's making it, or a price that's too high that would gouge customers. The idea of a just or fair price, um, it exists today, but it was a very strongly universally held idea at the time. And later economics begins to quibble with that, but in the Middle Ages, it was taken for granted that one price would be a fair one, and the guilds were in control of setting that price. They're competitive, and that's something we should keep in mind. They're each trying to show more pride in their own town or city than the other guilds. That nobody wants to be shown up, and in sort of the pageantry of social life, they take a really prominent place. But they also want their town to show off better than any other town or other city, and so they're really responsible for helping kind of build a lot of the civic spirit in having what we would call a small population, yet building grand buildings and huge cathedrals and wanting to make sure that what they have shines brighter than other competing cities. It's kind of, in a certain sense, they limited competition in their own particular field, but they drove competition in terms of civic pride, and they, as the kind of gatekeepers of wealth, they built up a lot of wealth themselves, and they were able to use that and the influence that they had socially to really kind of direct the government of the city. And so it's really pivotal to understand the guild system. Right? If we take a look at the social hierarchy of the Middle Ages, what you see is, of course, the king at the top and the higher vassals, nobles, or for that matter, bishops, right beneath him. The diagram doesn't really show, but of course, there are lower level vassals as well, or nobles, and in a sense, the knights who are the vassals of noblemen. And down the chain, the next step really is the townsmen, or as they've been called, burghers, right? Then, as well, of course, the peasantry, which are freemen, free peasants outright, serfs, who are free in the sense that they're not slaves, but they're bound to the land. They can't leave, but as we pointed out, they also can't be kicked off the land, and therefore they have a certain level of rights, even if it's not full scale. And then at the lowest level, which in the medieval world at this point, it was pretty uncommon, slaves who could actually be bought and sold. The great majority were either serfs or with a small percentage of freemen. And things are moving towards the end of the Middle Ages towards more and more free peasants. But at this point, many of them are serfs. And the whole the whole extension of Christendom, one country or the next, involve these kinds of sense of a common social tie. Everyone owing, as the arrows show in the diagram here, owing certain duties up the chain, and everyone up the chain owing certain responsibilities to those connected to them below the chain. So everyone is interacting together. However, it's the townsmen really that don't fit into this. The sitters don't really fit into the feudal system, and they're a very small part of the population by number, right? But almost because of that, they have a really important connection to trade and commerce and wealth and innovation to the degree that it exists in the Middle Ages, and they come to play a really huge role in the way things will change going forward. Now, what we see in terms of trade routes, because of course trade is important for the flow of wealth and the development of prosperity, right? Even to this day, most big volume trade happens by sea, by large boat. And we can see on the map and the trade routes there, but even better here as labeled, you have the old centers in the Mediterranean. This is the old center of all kind of major prosperity and major trade. Here on the western side, you have of northern Italy, you have Genoa. Here on the eastern side of northern Italy, you have Venice, and they are highly dominant throughout the Mediterranean. You can see, by the colors associated with them that they're dominating all this trade. And if you're wondering what's the purple, well, as we see here, the purple are where the Venetians and the Genoese are using those routes. But in the north, what we've been developing is these Hanseatic cities. They're members of the Hanse, as listed in our chapter. And they form a trade association with each other, building up a sense of kind of competition. And what doesn't show up clearly on this map is Flanders, this northern area here, right, that is just north of France and just across the North Sea from England, and happened to be the place where a lot of the major rivers of Europe end up dumping out in the ocean. And so because of that important trade, the place on the transportation connection systems of the waterways, these cities start growing up and becoming important sea trade cities as well. The result of that, of course, is a kind of competition, but also a natural interconnection between them. You have these southern centers here, the older cities in the Mediterranean, and the northern centers here in Flanders, as well as all these red dots, which are the Hanseatic cities, right? And the natural thing is for them to start discovering ways to interconnect their trade systems. Now, many merchants, of course, are traveling by river and traveling by road. Not everyone is sending large-scale goods by sea or in large ships and vessels. And so the natural thing is that they're going to end up intersecting with each other and finding a mid-ground point. To this day, the area that ends up taking that is still one of the most densely populated areas of Europe, right? And it's near Champagne. You can see the listing right here, Champagne. And that's not this dot. That's this dot right here. This dot over here is Frankfurt in Germany today. But Champagne, which is northern France, ends up being a nexus for a lot of this. And what's happening is that many places, especially in the region of Champagne, are beginning to realize that rather than all the trade barriers that exist from one region to the next, I mean, not just one country, but one region to the next, if they lower some of those trade barriers, lower some of their taxes, create markets to invite and entice merchants in, they get a lot more trade and they get a lot more prosperity from that. Maybe it's lower taxes, but lower taxes on more trade means more income, right? And so by attracting these merchants in from those port centers, from the port cities, they're able to start moving a lot more goods inland and building up a lot of prosperity, a flow of goods, a growth of commerce. Right, now, let's take a brief moment here to take a look. You want to copy this down. If you didn't have your notes out already, I should have mentioned that, but it's a good idea to have the notes out. Go ahead and pause this and copy down this special password because you're going to need it in a little while. Okay, so as we see here, these trade fairs do a lot to take what's already been expanding in terms of sea competition from old Mediterranean cities like Genoa or Venice, or for that matter, centers of trade centering in Sardinia, which is this island, in Sicily here, natural points of interconnection for, and they had been since ancient times for trading going across the Mediterranean, right? And bringing that into the continent, bringing that inland, using the rivers, using some roads, although roads were more difficult. They didn't have the highways that we have, or even well-developed roads. And they were more likely to hit bandits, etc. Using large, if you had a large amount of goods, you wanted to travel by water. Although it didn't have to be the sea, it could be rivers, especially the major rivers. Right. So what we end up seeing on this map, right, is a focus on those land routes. And notice the natural intersecting path. They end up centering right here, sort of in northern France, just south of the area of Flanders here. All right. Bringing that sea trade inland, right? And it's an important development at this time period. All right, guys. Well, that about wraps it up. You're going to need to use your special password. I hope you've copied that down. And I hope that this review has at least helped kind of explain some things and stitch some ideas together. Good luck on the test, and we will see you soon.